Kirk is a longtime former guild board member, longtime gardener, student in natural history, took up beekeeping, what, 12 years ago now? And he's been doing the Bees and Trees project. So, and he put together this really wonderful little brochure on what is good, what plants the bees will feed on that you can put in your yard, and it's got a lot of really good information in it. So there's a link to our page now in the chat, like I said. And he's been increasing his knowledge of Philadelphia trees. He did an inventory of street trees and trees in city parks for Philly Parks and Recreation. So he's a tree ID specialist. So we're hoping to hear about all the stuff we can expect bees to feed on from him. So here, I will.
Yeah, so is Dave on, do we know?
No, I
Dave Harrod?
He had to get off for a second.
I know, but the problem is I tried twice already to share my screen and it didn't work.
Well, here, let me hold on a
And
second.
maybe
Let me
you can. So when I click on it, I'm clicking again. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Even though
Yeah,
I
the
have
host is going to have to allow that.
I have a share screen icon there, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Try it now.
Okay. Yep, here it comes. All right, very good. And, oh,
Did it work?
well, kind of. Let's step by step here. There we go. Let's see if that worked. So you can see the Zoom thing, right?
Yep.
There it is. Okay, good. All right. So, yeah, I got involved in with the guild, and within a year or two, I got interested in what are the bees foraging on, and sort of moved on from there. I have another talk that goes through the whole trajectory, but this is more going off in a different direction. This isn't quite the topic that that I took on initially. I started working on maps and basically putting up some of Doug Sponsler's stuff, which we'll get to. And I thought, you know, this is really good. I just want to elaborate on that a little bit, and it's very relevant as a way of sort of setting up for Jessie Shiffler, who's going to be talking after me. So I'm going to try and keep my talk down to about half an hour or so. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is when I started with the bees and trees stuff 7 or 8 years ago, the interest, which is very common now in native plants, was not quite as heavy set. And so I'm a little old-fashioned. I'm not as much focused on native plants, although that was one of the first things that I learned when I was starting with the bees and trees, that native was certainly a consideration and also a very good idea. So I'll be sort of sketching out that that topic, and Jessie will be getting into it, I think, and we can have some conversation about it as well. So my topic is honeybee forage in an urban environment. And whoops, that didn't work. Nope, nope. All right. So happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. I'm going to start with this wonderful picture of Ireland. Perhaps this looks like what you might imagine when you think about Ireland. This is out of a book that I just came upon very recently, just a few weeks ago. And I'm looking through, and it points out that the word dairy is an anglicized version of the word in Irish for an oak grove. And all of these dots on this map are towns and localities in Ireland that have the word dairy in the name of their town. I found that crazy. It's in a book called The Irish Woods Since Tudor Time, and it talks about how the English and the Irish, especially the wealthy people in Ireland, proceeded to cut down all these oaks, use the wood and so on, and left Ireland pretty much open. You know, we talk about the shamrock or whatever, the wearing of the green, but trees were much more common in Ireland historically. This is a map of the United States. And geez, I wish I could get I'm sorry, I'm not even, it's ecoregions. I can't see the top of my screen, so I'm going to have to sort of, unless there's a way to change it. Here we go. Maybe that'll work. This is weird. Okay, sorry. Ecoregions. And we are here on the East Coast in the Atlantic, what is it, 63, Middle Atlantic coastal plain, most of Philadelphia. That's the part, that's actually the belt that comes all the way up from South Carolina all the way up through Delaware, up the river. And in the, we also in Philadelphia have a little slice of the Piedmont. So it's interesting, you know, going back to Ireland, what Ireland looked like in the 1500s, and look at you know, the United States or North America. You know, look back at what was there then, and that in some ways sort of sets the context for everything that we're doing with plants. These are the ecosystems here in Philadelphia, especially when you go back. But each of these had a different set of trees. So the upland forest, the Piedmont, had oaks, hickories, and so on. Tulip poplars were pretty common. The chestnut was really the dominant species in many ways. But that was lumbered out early on and was replaced to a large extent by tulip poplar. And for those who sort of are already familiar with different kinds of trees and so on, the tulip poplar is a very good bee tree. So we're very lucky to have it. Then the floodplains are in along the rivers, where you would have floods periodically. The coastal plain includes all of this area here, and I find it really fascinating because this line, as you go from one of these to the other, in fact, is very visible when you see it. So Belmont Plateau is right up here. Can you see my cursor? I'm not sure. Can you see the arrow there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all the way up. So, and the bee guild itself is sort of divided here between what we could call the upland and the lowland areas. And I would say really beekeeping is especially prevalent in the upper part of Philadelphia. And it also is pretty common in this lowland area, but it's interesting to think about it in terms of the ecosystems that would be here naturally if we didn't have a city. Let's see now. So when the bees fly out from our hive, this is for me the start of my interest. Like, where are they going? What are they foraging on? They generally forage in about a 2-mile radius, and especially in about the nearest half mile. But that's a really wide area, and it's important to realize whatever you plant for the bees, it'll never be enough for them. You know, some of our roots in beekeeping go back to you know, days when people had small farms and so on, and they could put in orchards, or they could grow buckwheat or something, and think about, okay, you know, I'm planting something for my bees. You know, the commercial pollinators can follow the crops and bring their bees to a place where something is in bloom for a while. But that's not the situation for us here in the city. I like to say that when you plant something for your bees, it does give you a chance to see them foraging, and you can say, those are my bees. You know, it's a little moment of pride there. So there are reasons to plant stuff even if you're not feeding them to any significant degree. But once you get into planting, or just the whole idea of what you can plant and so on, the best thing is to get involved with other people who are planting in the wider area. And this, again, goes back to the Bees and Trees Project. There are various groups in Philadelphia that are involved in planting, and especially shrubs and trees in the Philadelphia area. So it's good to know sort of what of those are bee friendly, and also friendly for other pollinators. My emphasis here is not going to be on. My emphasis here. Somebody needs to mute. Not on looking at the other pollinators. That's the talk would be 3 times longer if I tried to include all that. But you know, all the stuff that we plant for honeybees is also good for other pollinators, and it's important to keep that in mind. Okay. So this is a little app that everybody might be interested in checking out. It's under mapdevelopers.com, and you can draw a circle, a radius around any particular spot that you like. These are the 3 locations that we use for the Honey Fest. So this is Bartram's down here in Southwest Philadelphia, Wick House on Germantown Avenue, and Glen Ford over here. And just to give you an idea of what a 2-mile radius is, it's a pretty big area. This is a 1-mile radius around Aubrey Arboretum, where the guild has an apiary, and back in the old days we used to have meetings there, and we might even have a meeting there in June. I recommend and encourage everyone to come to our summer picnic at Aubrey Arboretum. It's on the west side of Washington Lane. It's in this area of our Aubrey called the Ag Village. So again, this is a 1-mile radius. So I can't even read. Damn, how do we get this out? Okay, here, let me get this over. All right. So honeybees can forage up to 6 miles or so out in a desert environment where if they don't have water, you can follow them or track them, and they will go as much as 6 miles to get water for their hive. That's one of the things they need. So we know that they can go up to 6 miles, and generally they'll be foraging within a half mile to a mile. Another principle is that they follow what we call flower fidelity. They attach in their mind to a particular flower by smell, by the color. Sometimes people actually fake the bees out in research where they have little colored paper that resembles the color that you would find, say, in dandelions or chicory or whatever, and the bees will go to that paper as well. So color is a part of that. And they'll stick to that species. They don't bumble around like a lot of like bumblebees do, for example. They really attach to one species and will forage on that one until it runs out. And when they find a lot of those flowers growing in an area, they'll go back to the hive, do their waggle dance, and recruit other bees to go to the same place. So a good, I've Googled this, and I tried to go back to wherever it was I heard this originally, and I couldn't do that. Maybe someone wants to chime in here or correct me, but roughly an acre of ground will be sufficient for a colony of bees. And that's assuming that it's pretty much all dirt ground and that it has a variety of plants growing there. But it's a rough yardstick, something to think about. This is the 6 mile radius around Aubrey and the 1 mile radius. So you can get a sense, 6 miles is a really big area. And so theoretically, the bees could be foraging out in that wider area. In practice, they're foraging almost entirely within the 1 mile. So if it's 1 acre per hive, we have to think about, well, maybe in an urban environment, maybe 1 acre wouldn't be sufficient. There's too many roofs and concrete and stuff, streets and all. But, you know, maybe a quarter of the space, or anyway, a fraction of more than 1/10 would be vegetation. You also have to consider that you might have more than 1 hive and that other people are keeping bees in your area. So those are all relevant considerations. But all that having been said, a 1 mile radius is, if you follow the formula, 3.4 square miles. That makes 640 acres per square mile, and then you multiply that by 3.14, you get more than 2,000 acres within a mile of your hive. So that's a lot of acres. You know, it's all very rough calculations, but something to think about. Another way of looking at it, I like, you know, there's Tom Seeley, who actually spoke at the Chester County Association meeting a few days ago, that developed an idea he calls Darwinian beekeeping. And he offers a number of different sort of rule of thumb ideas about what you can do to have to do beekeeping in a way which might resemble these sort of conditions in which bees are most conducive in a sense. And one of them is in spacing. So this, I don't think any beekeepers really do this, but he suggests, especially for disease and mite and so on, that the colony, and he also is pointing to the fact that in his research up in the Arno forest up in New York State, he finds that honeybee colonies are spaced roughly a half mile apart. And he suggests that we space our hives about 30 to 50 yards or more. I mean, it's also worth mentioning, here I am talking about trees. Forests are actually not a very good environment for honeybees overall. The plants that they forage on are generally in the open areas, at the edges of the forest where trees come down, in rocky areas, various different conditions that create a space where other plants can grow. There are some trees that are good honeybee forage, but they're not blooming all year. So that's something to keep in mind. But trees still, by my argument anyway, are a good idea. So I'm going to move through a couple of different studies that Doug Sponsler did here in Philadelphia. Actually, the first not in Philadelphia, out in Ohio, and the second here in Philadelphia. This is the first one. They're both available online. They're open, whatever you call it, open text. He had an apiary of 3 hives here, right on the line between the city, small city where he was studying, and countryside, which was farmed area. And he wanted to see which way the bees would go. Where were they foraging, given the choice? He looked at this up here is a graph showing the plants which are more typical in the urban environment down here, and the agricultural environment up here. And he found that at least during this span of time, from July through September, to the end of July, really, so it's August and September, they were foraging almost entirely on the sorts of plants you might find in a more open rural area. And these are all some of the different species that they identified by pollen that they brought in. So we get Solidago is, why am I blocking?
Goldenrod.
Goldenrod, thank you. I knew somebody would come in on that. Thank you very much. And trifolium is clover. And plantago is plantain. Not a plant that we notice the flowers on, but in fact, as we'll see in a minute, it is a pretty important forage source. So this is you can see that nothing is in bloom for, well, actually this is, it looks like, one of the clover. So clovers kind of extend through the whole period and actually start earlier in the summer. But a lot of them sort of come and then go, and that's really important. This is amazing, I think, this research that he did. So he recorded, and other researchers do this as well, recorded the waggle dance 17 times in this span of time, or on a particular 1 week, and then the next week 20. And he charted from looking at the waggle dance to see where it was that the bees were pointing to. And how far away. So the direction is in the waggle dance and the distance. And that gave him a reason for saying again that probably the more rural area was more conducive for bees. So he came to Philadelphia, and I found myself sitting next to this guy at one of our Bee Guild meetings, and I can't begin to recap what the actual conversation was, but I found out within a few exchanges back and forth that he was researching forage for bees. He grew up in Philadelphia, and he had, I think, some family connection to beekeeping. So he was coming back home, and he was going to look at forage in a city, in a North American metropolis. And this was his, I believe, his postdoc research. Really fascinating. Everybody should go find that article and look it up and read it, because I'll just show you some bits of it. So instead of looking at the waggle dance, he did a different study where he looked at the bees coming and going from each of these different apiaries around the city. Most of them, or if not all of them, were Don Shump's apiaries. So he worked with Don Shump, and he weighed the hives in an ongoing way, and he collected pollen that came into the hives so he could tell what kind of plants were being foraged around that particular location. And he was able to chart to some degree water areas. These are different, this kind of geographical study, they do a lot with land cover, what they call land cover. What is it that predominates in a particular area? You got water, trees, herbaceous growth, barren areas. Over here, the petroleum refinery and so on structures. This is the weight of the hives. And it shows you how, this is just a technical detail on how he charted the weight of the hives and the growth, the net growth of the hives. And then he worked it out to a chart here in terms of what is the relative input or consumption over time. So you have, he found here in Philadelphia, two bumps in the spring, not just one, but two flows, what we call flow, then a real dearth here in the early summer. It picks up later in the summer. There's a few plants that he discovered were providing forage, and then it drops again. Now I'm not seeing, here, hold on. Okay, I'm going to keep moving here. But this, he then wanted to see, well, what kind of pollen is coming in these different times. So this is sort of based on the assumption, which is not entirely true, that the bees are bringing back both pollen and nectar from the plants that they forage on. And so by checking the pollen, he would be able to tell something about what kind of plants the bees were visiting at the same time as when they brought in the nectar. I guess everybody here knows that bees, basically those are their two staples, the nectar, which they turn into honey, and pollen, which they use for protein and the minerals and other substances that they need to carry on. This is the first year. He did it 2 years in a row. The first year he started in June, and these are the plants that he found were most common in these various different locations. So these are the different apiary locations. And these are the plants that predominated in terms of the pollen that came in these different times. So then he ranked them, and he says, okay, Crataegus, which is hawthorn, was the single most common in June. Gleditsia, which is honey locust, Rus, which is sumac trees, and so on. I don't even know all of these. I have it written down, but Nyssa is a fun one. Where'd that go? Here. That's actually black gum, which is related to the tupelo. The tupelo tree down south has a really excellent honey. Well, the black gum here in Philadelphia is a source for at least a lot of pollen here, and probably nectar as well. So that's a good bee tree. In July, I won't go through these in detail, but August and September, that was in 2017. In 2018, he was able to start in May and continue through October, so 6 months in that year. This is willow, maple, oak. So we got oak pollen in there, even though we know that oaks don't actually have flowers that provide nectar. Somehow pollen was getting into the mix. Apple, platanus, there it is. The plantain plants are already showing up here. And I think, there it is again, plantago. Maybe over here, I'm not sure. Paulownia is an invasive tree in the Philadelphia area, imported as a sort of a majestic tree with beautiful purple flowers and so on, but it's gotten to be a really pernicious weed tree in the city, and so on. So you can see that there's a lot of variance here between the different locations. and some of them sort up to the top and pretty much are all across the board in the city, and others there's just a lot of it in one place or another, right? This is his breakdown in 3 different respects. One is what kind of plant it is. One is if it's a herbaceous plant, is it a perennial, a biennial, or an annual? And then he looks at what is native and what is introduced to the area. So this, we can start at the bottom here. Introduced are species that are not native to this area and that provide, in many months of the year, the vast bulk of the resources that the bees are bringing in. In the spring, in June, there's quite a bit of native. And again here, May and June. And that would include, it's hard, he was working at the genus level, so he's looking at crab apples and hawthorns and other trees that are, especially trees that are common and are also native to this area. But later in the year, August and September, and going into October, there are other kinds, and not just trees. So these are trees, the dark green, it kind of drops in the course of the year. So trees are good in the summer. Then there's a couple of trees that provide a lot of forage in August. And then herbaceous kicks in, no, vines kick in, I'm sorry, at the end of the year. This is the herbaceous plants here. As I said, this is out there. It's on the web. You can find it. The title for it down here, Characterizing the Floral Resources of a North American Metropolis. Great title to read and to study, really, if you're a beekeeper, in terms of what's coming in at different times of the year. When is, just the fact that there are 2 flows in the spring is good information. You think you're getting ahead of them, and then they slacken off, and you're like, okay, I can turn my my attention to other things in my life, and then all of a sudden they're bursting again. Yeah, Chris.
I put the link in the chat.
Okay, you found the link for the article. Yep. Good. All right. So these are 3 books that are sort of the standard in the place to start. One of the first books I found is this one, Garden Plants for Honeybees by Peter Lintner, an older gentleman in Chester County. He had access and he visited various arboretums in his area and watched and horticultural gardens, longwood gardens, and so on. And he watched what plants are attracting honeybees. And then he studied their pollen, and he actually did what he could to assess how much nectar those plants were providing. And he, in his book, goes through which ones are good for pollen, which ones are good for nectar. He was completely oblivious, or he didn't care to, or didn't feel like it was worth the effort to spell out which ones were native and which ones were introduced to the area. Some of the ones in his book are actually invasive. But they're all in the book, the ones that he found, and it's a good place to start. I used that book very heavily initially to try and get a sense of, where do trees fit into this. The second book is Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home. He has other books as well, but this is a very strong influence now in a lot of people's efforts to replant and rebuild a habitat in our areas. And his emphasis here is native plants. And if you read the book, or if you're familiar with the arguments that a lot of people will make these days, native plants are head and shoulders, even more than that, better than non-native for a variety of different reasons. This book takes a complete opposite tack. Wild urban plants of the Northeast. It's worth getting this book if you're looking at plants and wondering what they are. And this book is very detailed about the conditions that they'll grow in. It just has a lot of really good information about most of the plants that you're likely to see in a city that have, this is the point, propagated themselves and are fending for themselves in the urban environment. These are not the ones that people are planting necessarily. They might be with some of them, but a lot of them are just out there doing their own thing in an urban environment. And it's really interesting if you read, there's through the text, he talks about how, parking lots and skyscrapers and all different kinds of environments actually replicate natural settings in a natural world. So the plants that would do well in those settings in the natural world are also doing well in urban areas. So between these three books, I think somebody could get a really good sense of a lot of the different issues that come up as they relate to beekeepers and keeping bees and all the rest of that. Talamy really doesn't care for honeybees. So that just so you know, that's how divergent these different books are. So this was something I put together early on when I finally realized, I was encouraging people to plant trees on the street. And street trees, there are certain trees that you're allowed to plant on the street, and other trees that you're really not supposed to plant. Cottonwood, pawpaw, for example, the willows, black cherry, these different ones down here are not in the blue circle, so they're not typical street trees. These are the bee-friendly trees. These are not particularly, although we saw oaks in the pollen that Doug was collecting. Most of these are wind pollinated. And these here are in the middle under three categories are the sort of trees that would meet all three criteria. But it was a way of thinking about all of these different considerations and how they chart against each other. All right, so I have 5 minutes to 8. I want to take another 5 minutes or so. But maybe we could stop here and have a little conversation if anybody wants to. I see there's been some comments in the chat, but maybe that's mostly just you, Chris.
I was posting links to the articles.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyone? I think there are few of us.
There's also, wait.
Just a couple of gratitude posts.
I see you have the BB tree on this chart, and I have a little story because we got 2 BB trees directly from Peter Lintner himself. Peter was an awesome, gentle soul that we were members with in the CCBA. Sometimes we would sit next to him at meetings. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. But these 2 BB trees were near and dear to us because we got them directly from him, and he really liked them. But once we learned more, and we learned that they got moved to the invasive species list after we planted them, we have removed them. So while we knew those trees got big enough, they might be a good nectar source to turn into honey, we learned more about, how they negatively can affect the ecosystem. So we did remove them. So interesting story.
Yeah.
I saw the BB tree on there. It's the Korean Evodia tree is the name for it. And as the name would indicate, anything with Korean, Japanese, Russian, all that kind of stuff, it's easy to tell if they're not native.
Yeah.
And
so up here are some other examples of not native trees. The Makia, golden rain, Cornus moss. Cornus moss has been blooming in my backyard for a couple of weeks already. And honestly, it's not invasive. Okay, let's make that clear. But I see a lot of other pollinators on that. It's in the dogwood family, and it blooms early in the spring. And so that's an example. Just to each of these. This is the interesting thing with trees and with other plants as well, is unique in some ways. It's always unique. And so some will be like like the BB tree considered to be invasive. Others are not, but not native. The golden rain and the makia do very well on the street. So in the city environment, the trees that can survive on the streets are good. Golden rain, I noticed, was among the trees that Doug found were toward the top of what the bees were bringing in terms of pollen during the summer. So, and some of these are the trees that do fill in the gap in the mid to late summer.
Kirk, didn't we hear in a recent meeting, or perhaps it was at the Chester County event, that Devil's Walking Stick is a native plant?
Well, there are two, actually, it's Aralia is the genus, and there are two species. One of them is from East Asia, and that's the one that's prevalent in this area. I could talk for 10 minutes about it. It's really fascinating because it's considered to be native in parts of Western Pennsylvania and New York State. But the Iroquois planted it. They very possibly brought it from the southern parts where it does grow is more prevalent, and brought the seeds with them up north and planted them because it had various uses for them. They could eat the berries, and it has a sort of a very thorny stalk or whatever. It doesn't grow into a really big tree, but they could use it in various ways, sort of to define space. So yeah, John Bartram or his son brought it up and had it growing at Bartram's garden. Some botanists did an inventory of plants that were growing in Bartram's garden at the end of the 1800s, and they thought they found the native variety, but it seems, looking back, they're very hard to tell apart. That it actually was the invasive species, which had already been introduced through the nursery trade. Yeah, so each of these trees has its own story. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes going through. This is from my bees and trees spiel, but if you came here to look at pictures of trees, that's what we'll do now. These are some of the bee-friendly trees that are to be considered, and vines as well, shrubs, vines, and these different ones here. We'll take a look at some of them, and then I'll hand over. Well, we can have more discussion, or I can hand over to Jessie. So this is early in the spring, and these are the so wild plum is a really nice one. I see bees all over it. That's native, and a lot of other pollinators as well. Black cherry is another native and very prevalent in this area, actually. That's one that's definitely spreads itself around in the Philadelphia area. You don't have to plant it. It's already growing wherever it gets a chance. If they're not mowing in a park, there's a good chance that it's growing there among the other trees. Crabapple doesn't really get around a whole lot. Chokecherry, I don't see a lot of that around, but I think there's some out there in the mix. These are the hawthorns. I think the word haw is related to a word for making a hedge or a barrier. And so that is pretty common practice, but it can grow to be, especially, for example, the Washington hawthorn can be a pretty big tree. Holly is a good one. This is the tulip poplar. Called poplar because of the wood. It has a sort of a yellow, fine, well-grained wood, not particularly dense. It does grow quite quickly, actually. But it has, and you don't often see these flowers if you're not looking for them because they're up high in the tree, at the top of the tree. Once you know what they look like and so on, or when they start falling on the ground after they've bloomed, then you'll start to notice it. And interestingly, the nectar is produced by the petals around the outside, down at the base of the petal. It's actually, I'm not doing anything about evolution of trees, which I had hoped to do today, or had thought I might do. But the tulip poplar is related to magnolia, and the magnolias may be, and probably are, the original flowering plant. You have to go back more than 100 million years, but it was not the sort of herbaceous plants that you see flowering. Those didn't come for another 50 or 60 million years. Trees were the first flowers. And the magnolia was probably the original. And then the tulip poplar is a sort of another spin-off from that. This is the linden. There are more than three main varieties that you'll see around Philadelphia. Very bee friendly, and in Europe is well known as a bee tree. This gives you an idea of the linden surviving in a city environment, not doing great. You know, you've got your heavy sidewalk and very small tree pits and so on, but managing to survive, and often you'll find these trees doing a whole lot better than that. The Franklinia, you don't see around a whole lot. It was the Bartrams brought it up from northern Florida, where they found it, and it went extinct there. And so the only Franklinias are around in the world are in the nursery trade. But it has it's in the tea family, and has a beautiful and very very nicely scented flower that produces a lot of nectar and a lot of pollen. The bees really love it. These are some of the sumacs. And the nice thing about that, just to point out, they bloom at different times in the year. So this one blooms in March, April, this one in June, this one in July, the red sumac that I think we're most familiar with, and then shining sumac blooms even later in the summer. So those are worth experimenting with if you have a chance. These are the...
Hey, Kirk, can I ask a question
Yeah.
about the sumacs? Are
Mhm.
they all like edible, not edible, but like you can make tea out of the red sumac, but then I've heard that there's poison sumac too.
Yeah, there is a poison sumac. I believe that has white berries and they hang downward.
Okay.
This is not it on the upper left, but it would look more like that. So anything that has upright, I mean, you should Google it or whatever to be sure, but
Sure. I just thought I'd ask.
the upright red berries are usually the actually I think some of these others do turn into red as well. But those are, yeah, you can, the other thing you can do, beekeepers can do, you can let them dry out and put them in your smoker.
Mm,
So that's
cool.
something you can do with staghorn sumac fruit.
Kirk, can I add a little tip on that? Making Indian lemonade with the staghorn sumac cones.
All right.
You find them, you try to harvest them in late August or early September. And how you go up and test them is you rub your finger on the fuzzy berries and you lick your finger. And if it tastes like lemon, you know, has like a tart taste to it, they're ripe. So you can cut them off and you cold steep them. Don't steep them in warm water. It brings out some bad flavors, but you cold steep them for a couple of days, throw some stevia leaves in there, and it makes a delicious Indian lemonade.
Yeah, that's great. It's also used as a spice in the Middle East. I don't know if it's the staghorn or another kind of sumac, but they take the berries and grind them up and will put it in food for that sour flavor. Quite common in some parts of the Middle East. I think we're almost done. These are the late summer, including the BB tree here. You can see it's covered with bees in this picture. Sourwood is a native. I think it typically grows more down south than it does here. And I think, as I recall, it's most common in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. But that's a good one. And I know of a few that are growing around the Philadelphia area and doing quite well. Makia is from East Asia, northern part of East Asia. And is a really good and fairly common street tree. And golden rain, similar, comes from, I believe, in East Asia. It has yellow flowers, and then it has, put this picture in there because the pods are what really distinguish it. If you see these pods on a tree, and you might see some left over from last year, that's the golden rain tree. And we can go down to shrubs, different kinds of shrubs. Hydrangea was definitely in the mix of pollen that Doug documented as a very common source. And I think a lot of it might be oak leaf hydrangea. Has, according to Peter Lintner, anyway, I believe, oak leaf hydrangea is an especially good source for pollen and nectar. These are some of the others. And I can say that, for example, the water department has done a bunch of projects around the city, different ways to absorb water into the ground rather than have it run into the sewers. And they are planting a lot of these, buttonbush, summer sweet. There's a number of different, especially shrubs and sometimes trees. They really are emphasizing native in their plantings. So it's really worth paying attention to what the water department in Philadelphia is doing with their plantings along streets. So most people have probably seen it. They cut out the pavement along the street, or they put in special sort of, what do you call them, drains or whatever on the side of the street into an area where they have plants growing. And the idea is to get that water into the ground so they don't have to process it. And we might be at the end. That's it. So thank you, everyone. That's a little bit of background on honeybees out in our urban environment and what they're foraging on.
So cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirk. That was great. Fantastic.
Yeah, I see Debbie asked about the Polonia. Yes, they're very invasive. When you look up at abandoned buildings and you see trees growing out of the windowsills and through the roofs of houses, it's almost always Polonia trees.
They have giant leaves, right?
Yeah,
They
big
have really
leaves
large leaves.
and bright blue flowers, and the seeds are very wispy. They're little discs of seed, like a little papery disc with a tiny little seed in the middle of it, and those will blow all over the place.
I've heard that the seeds were actually used as a packing material.
Yeah, I think I've heard that too. Yeah,
And they in the late 19th century, things that were imported from China were packed in those Polonia seeds, and of course they just dumped them. That's one of the places. It's an amazing tree, the Polonia. It grows very, very fast.
yeah,
And it's used to make surfboards. But it's also in Asian cultures. It's a highly valued tree. In Japanese, especially in Japan, it's a highly valued tree because it grows very quickly and the wood can be worked immediately. It doesn't have to be cured and dried.
yeah. No, I
But
have a story. I was in my tree inventory job. I was at the Juniata Golf Club. By the parking lot, they have a really big Polonia tree, huge, like 15 feet in diameter or something, one of the biggest I've ever seen. And apparently some Japanese gentleman came by and asked if he could cut it down and take the wood, and said that they make coffins out of that wood. As you say, it's really easy to work and it's very smooth and just perfect for making coffins. So
yeah, yeah.
they didn't sell their tree though. All right.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to get too much later. We are blessed to have a second speaker tonight. We have Jessie Shiffler here. She is the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter of Wild Ones. And Wild Ones is this fascinating organization dedicated to educating the public about the ecological benefits of choosing native plants. So we have a different focus here. Why, if you have a choice, you should definitely go for native plants, and why that's happening and how that can work with feeding the bees too. She's also co-founder of Hat Trick Honey. She volunteers for Natural Lands Force of Nature. She's chair of the Chester County Beekeepers Association Horticulture Committee. She does all this great stuff and has a passion for native plants. So I'm really happy to have Jessie here tonight to talk to us about the native plants. Anyway, Jessie.
I am here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, here, let me make you a co-host so you can share your screen. Wait, let me find you here. And we can, while I'm looking for that, I did want to say we are, hopefully we'll have some more time for questions for both Jessie and Kirk at the end. Wait a minute, here you go. Let's try that. How's that work?
Yeah, man, here we go. All right, guys. So a lot of what Kirk covered, you're going to see some duplicates, some not. Like Chris said, my focus is native plants. Our non-native honeybees will go to lots and lots of plants, so I don't plant for them in particular. It's our native bees and our native insects that need sometimes specific plants that they rely on. So if you plant for the specialists, you're going to cover the generalists, and the honeybees will have plenty. When you're thinking about planting, think about covering all of your seasons of bloom, evaluate your area, and decide where you're lacking plants, where you're lacking plants that bloom, that provide that nectar and honey for insects. If you're giving at least 3 different flowering plants in each season, you're doing pretty good. That's a great place to start. Combine herbaceous plants with shrubs and trees for your best ecological function, and it looks prettiest. And think about all those layers in your planting, covering the ground with plants instead of with mulch, then a shrub layer, an understory tree layer, and your canopy trees. So a lot of times you may have 1 or 2 of those layers already in your landscape, and you can just add to it to get all the layers covered. Think about your growing conditions, because matching your right plants to your right place are going to get you the biggest satisfaction out of your plantings. If you have moist soil in full sun, you want to pick native plants that want to be in those locations instead of trying to amend your soil to meet a certain plant's growing conditions. Now I'm going to take you through the whole year in blooms. The majority of these plants are natives. I try to specify when they're not natives, and all of the non-native plants that I specify, I keep in there because they're typical lawn plants that you might find that certain places may tell you want to chemically treat or do some crazy poisoning to get rid of them, when they do have they're serving a purpose, even if it is just a little bit of nectar or pollen, but it definitely doesn't warrant poisoning them or our earth to get rid of them. So in January, there's not a lot of things blooming, but I do like to check out the buds on a lot of different plants because they're swelling, getting ready. They're just waiting to pop up. And this was a little guy that I found hanging off of my high bush blueberry. He's probably some kind of a little bagworm. Hopefully a little bird got to have a feast later in the year from him. Kirk had an amazing picture of Mahonia blooming on Facebook I saw not long ago. These are both, the Mahonia is most likely a non-native variety, and the picture on the right is the hellebore, which is also non-native, but they bloom early, sometimes as early as January. I think this year it was into February when they were going. This is a native witch hazel. The funny part about this plant is it's actually native a little further west into Ohio than we are, but it survives well here because we have very similar ecoregions. Where I am, I'm 64A, which is the upper Piedmont, and I think part of Philly touches 64A also. February, we're moving on to, that is, I never do get this plant in full bloom, but you can see a honeybee in the middle picture in February on that Mahonia. Actually, in all of those pictures, I think there are honeybees. So I try to capture the insects when I can. So even on a warm day in February, I planted these right by our hives just for this purpose, so that if they could get out on a warm day, they'd be able to reach this. In March, more non-native winter aconite. I've really focused this year on adding native early spring ephemerals to my property to improve what I have native available early in the year. So as I get those to bloom, I will add them to the presentation. But we have hepatica, which is one of our earliest native blooming ephemeral plants. They take advantage of the lack of canopy cover, and they photosynthesize really early in the season, and then they go dormant once the trees take up that sunlight. Pussy willow is one of the best protein sources for our pollinators early in the spring. 40% protein versus dandelions, which are only 15%. So while I don't want you to poison your dandelions, they're not native, and everybody touts how great they are for pollinators. Well, pussy willow's much, much better. Hellebor's there, the dandelions there, and our silver maples are one with red maple that are some of the earliest trees to start blooming in the spring. So in March, the silver and the red maples are popping. This is just a little reminder that you don't need to clean up your yards really early in the season. I know it's exciting, those first warm days in February and March when you want to get out there and tidy things up, but there might be a lot of native pollinators in those stems. So if you take everything down to the ground, you could have just killed this year's pollinators. So if you leave your stems at 12 or 18 inches forever, that's going to give our native insects the best chance they have for habitat. They like hollow stems, and new research is coming out that they tend to like last year's hollow stems, not this year's hollow stems. So there's a neat graphic somewhere that you could probably find on the internet that shows like 3 years of hollow stems and how they are rotated through. That's interesting. So gentle cleanup. If you have to do anything, think about those pupating or overwintering insects that might be in there.
Love that tip.
Do nothing, right? I love that.
Right, I love it.
So April will really start going. We've got cherry trees that are starting to bloom, speedwell, which is a non-native that's in most everybody's lawn, and henbit. Also, you can see honeybees in all of these pictures. Golden currant is one of our earliest fruiting shrubs that blooms. We've got purple dead nettle that's all over my property now that's blooming. And the native barren strawberry, it actually does produce berries, but they're not edible for us, although wildlife really do like them. They're good in early flowerers, and they make a great ground cover. They'll spread, and then you don't have to mulch all the time. Our violets are beautiful early flowering plants. They are great host plants for fritillary caterpillars. They will spread very nicely if you just let them be. We have trillium that start in April. There's again another example of our native ephemeral plants taking advantage of that lack of overhead canopy cover. And then I'm trying to move this. Let's see. Cherry and magnolia trees are starting to bloom in the middle of April. The native plum is covered in flowers and in insects. Peach tree, which is one of our fruit trees, non-native, and redbud is a really neat native plant that gets blooms all up and down its trunk and branches, which has a fun term. Kirk, do you remember? It's like cauliflory or cauliflower, something like that. It's a neat little term.
Yeah, I love it. And then they grow little like pea pods they're on the trunk afterwards.
Yes, and there are certain bird species that time their migration with when those types of pods are available. So we take a very short view on effects, like what in our lifetime do we get to see happen. But these insects and plants and birds have evolved together over tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years to get this timing right. And if they don't have those resources that they have evolved with, they can perish. So it's important to put these native plants out there so that the timing stays the same. The world is changing so much. Climate change is changing things so much. We want to try and do the best we can and put these plants out there. Hope that they can evolve along with the changing and the temperatures. Anemone virginiana is tall thimbleweed. That makes another great ground cover, especially if you have a lot of ground to cover. One plant will give you 400. It's a generous giver. So if you have a lot of space to cover, put a couple of those in. They will outcompete turf grass, which is rare. So that's a good one. Golden ragwort is another early blooming spring plant. It's not ephemeral though. It has an evergreen rosette, so it will protect your ground all year long. It makes a great ground cover. It gets these, if you see in the picture, there are these purple buds. So you think you're going to have a purple plant bloom, a purple flower bloom, and then there are these bright yellow happy daisy-like flowers. So it's very surprising. Red elderberry is a really fun, nice budding and blooming plant that blooms before black elderberry. So they cover a large space and time. May apples pop up in the beginning of April. They have a flower that is held underneath of them. So unless you're on the ground kind of scavenging around, you might not see them. And then they produce a little fruit that box turtles really like. And then that top picture is of one of the earliest blooming phlox species, Phlox stolonifera. No, Phlox stolonifera, yeah. It doesn't get very tall, and it makes a nice accented ground cover. Tiarella is one of my favorites. It's such a pretty little flowering plant. In the second picture, there's also the blue flowers are Jacob's ladder in the background. And then wild columbine is another generous sower. If it likes where it's at, it will pop around and give you lots of babies. In May, we have the start of our viburnums that bloom. Prunifolium is one of the earlier ones, but there's usually a viburnum blooming from May until July, probably. Dogwood is another one that blooms kind of consecutively. This one is the alternifolia or pagoda dogwood. Your azaleas, the native azaleas start blooming, and the way native azaleas do not stay evergreen. So if you have evergreen azaleas, and a lot of people do as their foundation plantings, they're a hybrid or not native because we don't have any evergreen azaleas that are native. Here's a picture of that golden ragwort when it's in full bloom. It's a lovely sight. A different viburnum now, the American cranberry. It's not an edible cranberry, but the berries are big and red, like similar to a cranberry. The coral honeysuckle is one of the longest blooming plants I've ever met. It will start here in April, and I had blooms last year until November. The biggest bloom was in April, where the majority of the plant bloomed all at once, but then consistently the entire rest of the year, it put out impressive blooms, like more than one at a time. It was really lovely. And it is the host plant for the clearwing moth, which are like little fairies in your garden. And hummingbirds are attracted to the flowers, so you just can't get a better plant. Sheep laurel is one of our native laurels, similar to our state plant, the mountain laurel. White fringe tree is another magical plant when it's in bloom because it's fuzzy, covered in like little wispy blooms. Common 9-bark. There are a lot of cultivars of that you'll find even at Lowe's or Home Depot, but the straight species tends to get the most insect action. And Bowman's root is a pretty little plant that's good for shade. Lovely little wispy flower blooms. This is an example of a 9-bark hybrid on the left and the straight species on the right, and the difference in the size of bloom and the color of the foliage, which makes a big difference when you're an insect. That if you change the leaf color of a plant, it changes its chemical makeup, and therefore the insects that could have eaten that leaf can no longer do so. So it doesn't serve all of the functions that it could have served. Northern flag iris, really great for wet places. Goat's beard is very similar to a stilby that is the non-native that is sold in a lot of big box stores, but goat's beard is it has a similar look to it, especially when in bloom. Into June, and a lot of times June is considered by beekeepers to be the dearth. There tends to be less plants available, but I am here to tell you there are plenty of plants, native plants that you can pick to provide for the dearth. Goat's beard again is still going. 9-bark is still going. Elderberry, the black elderberry, is at its peak in June, covered in insects. The catalpa tree is starting to bloom in June. Spiderwort can bloom earlier than June, but it is really strong in June and goes off and on sporadically. And the bees tend to take a lot of pollen away from that one, like their baskets are loaded when they leave that plant. St. John's wort, there's lots of varieties, both native and non-native, so kind of do your homework before you purchase that one. Purple coneflower is touted as being a native plant. It's kind of a champion. It's on a lot of the posters for native plants. It's not actually native to PA, but it is a lovely plant. Birds love the seeds. I don't see many bees on it really, actually, to be honest, but it's still a good plant to have. Oak leaf hydrangea, like Kirk said, is a great, not sure if it's pollen or nectar. My guess is nectar source. But the fun part about that plant is all those big white flowers that you're seeing in the picture are actually the sterile flowers that are kind of just for show. And underneath there are the flowers that are actually providing the nectar that draw in the insects. So if you watch this plant when they're in bloom, you'll see all of the bees kind of dig in under those big flowers that we're seeing, and they disappear, and then they come back out like all happy because they just struck gold underneath there, what we would see as the flower. Smooth hydrangea is another native that's actually more native to this ecoregion that provides a lot of pollen and nectar. And Mount Cuba Center did a study to look at the nectar and pollen resources from different hydrangeas. So that's a good study you can check out if you're interested in trying to pick the best one. The native bush honeysuckle is a good nectar source for our native bees. If you see in that picture, there's a pretty, probably bumble, maybe carpenter bee on there. Flame azalea and evening primrose are in the summertime. Common milkweed, really important for the monarchs, but also all of the other insects that depend on milkweed. Purple milkweed is a really pretty one that you can't find anywhere except native plant specific nurseries. It's a little finicky to grow, but it's got that really pretty purple midrib. And I was fortunate to have some success with it 1 year. We'll see how long-lived it is. The American smoke tree is really neat. When it's in full bloom, it almost looks like it's covered in pink cotton candy. Winterberry holly. All of the hollies would be easy to walk past and not notice their bloom. The flowers are very small, but the bees notice them. They are highly visited. And then the birds notice them later when they set their great red berries. Wild quinine is a really neat plant that is another aggressive spreader and has a really long bloom time. So the bees were really liking that one. Cardinal flower attracts a lot of hummingbirds. Prickly pear cactus. It's amazing to think that we have cactuses that are native to this area, but what a beautiful flower. I wouldn't get too close though. They are very, very prickly. Celandine wood poppy, not to be confused with the lesser celandine, which is an invasive plant. This is a native that we would be happy to see volunteer. Meadowsweet is a shrub that needs full sun. It's Spirea alba is its native, the botanical name. And you see a lot of Spirea that is for sale, or Spirea, some people say, for sale at big box stores. And that is the Japanese type. And their habits are different. Their flower color is different, but if you can find the native, stick with that one. It provides much more for our ecosystem. biggest bang for your buck, if you can only pick one native plant and you want to attract pollinators, get mountain mint. There's at least 4 different kinds that are native to our area. This is Virginia mountain mint, Pycnanthemum virginianum. It has more slender leaves than the other mountain mint that you'll see later. This is just another picture of coral honeysuckle, still going. Lots of phloxes available and a lot of cultivars. The cultivars tend to bloom sooner, so I think that the insects that are dependent on them in space and time are thrown off by the cultivars because they are blooming sooner than they really should. So the straight species are in the back of this picture and they're not quite bloomed yet, but they definitely, when they're both in bloom at the same time, I noticed the straight species got a lot more action. Scarlet bee balm and wild bergamot, they're both monardas and they are in the mint family. They are aggressive when they're happy. So you want to either pick the right spot for them where they can cover a lot of ground for you, or maybe keep them in a pot so they can't go too far. But they are a really great plant because they provide nectar all day long. So you will see on some plants, you'll see insects visiting only in the morning or only in the afternoon, because that's when the plant is providing resources for that insect. Well, you'll see insects on Monarda all day long because they provide nectar all day long. Into July, we have buttonbush, which is great for those wet spaces. Red twig dogwood, cup plant, which is an amazing 8, 10, 12 foot tall, giant herbaceous plant that has, I think the word is perfoliate leaves, where they meet around the stem and they form a little cup. And when it rains, they fill with water, and then birds and insects come and use them as like a little bird bath or water source. It's really great to watch them. And the bees love the bloomed flowers. Daisy fleabane is a volunteer most places. I don't know many people who purchase it to plant it anywhere, but it's a really long blooming, like from June and July all the way to November plant. And there are annual and biennial, and I also believe perennial species of the same genus, and some are native and some are non-native, and how you would tell the difference, you would have to be a professional botanist. I think I don't know how to tell the difference. Downy wood mint, another great native that can tolerate part shade, which is kind of, it's on the more rare side for the mint family. Has multiple blooms down a stem, covered in insects all year. Also in the mint family, so likes to spread. Queen of the Prairie and oxeye sunflower make such a pretty combination. Sometimes I feel like I'm walking through Eden when these are in plant. Like, I'm pretty sure this is what paradise looks like. They're just so lovely. Good for wet places in full sun. There's some of that straight species garden phlox. They do get tall. I got to see hummingbird moths flitting around them. They seem to like them. American beautyberry is a shrub. Gets really small blooms right along the stems and the axils of the leaves and the stems, and then gets beautiful purple berries later in the season. It's hard to believe that's a color that is like just in nature. Really neat. Anise hyssop is the licorice scented plant in the mint family. When it's happy, it can go all over the place. I don't find that it's as aggressive as some people do. It must not be as happy with me as some other places, because I've heard that it likes to take over, but that's not been my experience. This is the anemone, the tall thimbleweed that we talked about earlier. So it's still blooming. This is what month are we in? July, I think. Still blooming from back in May or April. Butterfly weed is a milkweed that is a little more finicky than your common or your swamp milkweed. It likes drier soil and it likes to be left alone. It establishes a really long taproot. So if you disturb it, it's not happy and it'll die on you. It's also not the preferred milkweed of monarchs because it doesn't produce that toxin that helps protect the caterpillars from being eaten. I don't think it does it at all, but if it does produce it, it's definitely not to the extent that the common or swamp milkweed do. So it's a lovely plant if you want to provide for monarchs and you only have a small space, so you don't want an aggressive milkweed. It's a good one. It's just not their top choice. White avens is a really neat volunteer plant. Again, it's one that I don't see for sale often, but it keeps a evergreen rosette, so it makes for protecting your ground covers over winter really nice. Different coreopsis. This is the broadleaf, which is a more aggressive coreopsis. Wild senna is in the pea family, so it sequesters nitrogen, and it is a really tropical, fun-looking plant. And there are several bees in that picture. It's just hard to tell. I am a big fan of pokeberry or pokeweed, some people say. The blooms provide for insects. The leaves host a certain leopard moth caterpillar, which is really exciting. And the berries feed birds all winter. Also, it's tropical and beautiful. And if it was for sale at Lowe's, everybody would buy it because it's got those cool red stems and it's lovely and tropical looking. But because you can find it everywhere outside your door, nobody wants to buy it, so they don't market it. Gray-headed coneflower, another good one that provides seeds for the birds later in the winter. Wild petunia is really cute when it emerges from the ground. It looks like little Pac-Man mouths, but each bloom only lasts for a day or two, but it blooms pretty consecutively for several weeks. Sweet pepper bush, plethora is a native that is it's touted for its sweet smell and blooms. Stokes aster, honeybees love that one. Purple flowering raspberry doesn't make edible raspberries for us, but wildlife like it, and the flowers are just lovely. Culver's root is a really neat, tall, slowly clump forming perennial that gets a lot of insect attention. I found the largest leafcutter bee I've ever seen. It was probably an inch long at least on Culver's root. It was really fascinating. Into August, plants are still going. You've got your hoary mountain mint that provides really neat flat flower clusters that are covered in bees. Coralberry is starting to bloom there. Great blue lobelia, which is a cousin to cardinal flower. Boneset, again, another volunteer that a lot of us get. That just means a free giant plant covered in blooms, very good smelling. Lots of insects love it. Blue mist flower covers the ground well, but it's herbaceous, it dies to the ground. So it wouldn't make a great all-season ground cover, but for bare spots in summer, it's very nice. Sneezeweed. Beautyberry, I had shown pictures of the flower buds earlier. This is when they're in full bloom, and you can see there's a tiny little, some kind of something. I don't know if it's a bee or somebody there liking those blooms. Joe Pyeweed is my absolute favorite plant ever. There's several different species that are good for all different conditions, some shorter, some gigantic. Highly recommend them. Heuchera is a good one that does usually keep an evergreen rosette, so good for ground cover all year. Excuse me, groundnut is a vine. The Native Americans would grow this along with what's it called? Sunchoke, as almost like a three sisters kind of a deal, where the sunchoke would provide the stalk that the ground nut could grow up. and the groundnut has a harvestable edible tuber that you can eat, but it's in the pea family as the flower looks like. So the passion flower, it's hard to believe that that tropical looking flower is native, but it is. And they produce a neat little green fruit also. Oxeye, daisy, and mountain mint there, still blooming. Lots of Joe pieweed and phlox. Great blue lobelia still going in July and August. The swamp milkweed is blooming later in whatever month we're in, July, I think, August maybe. More Joe pie. Butterfly weed still going, more Joe. This was a perennial buckwheat that lasted a few years in my yard, but it wasn't super happy here. I don't think it came back for this year. Elephant foot is a neat plant. It must be in the mint family. It has a mint kind of shape to it. Lots of pollinators on it. It, even in winter, has held that dense structure, so it's a nice plant for all seasons. Giant ragweed is a native plant, and this is the one that if you have allergies, you probably have seasonal allergies to it. It produces a lot of pollen that is airborne. So when people see goldenrod in bloom, they think their allergy is to goldenrod because the flower is so showy and they're sneezing. But it's actually probably this ragweed that they're allergic to, but they don't see it because the flowers are not showy. And I figured because it was wind pollinated that insects wouldn't really like it. But as you can see in that picture, it has a honeybee on it collecting pollen. So at least in that instance, it was useful to an insect. And then beggar ticks is lovely in bloom. It's a pain when it is pollinated and sets seed because all you have to do is walk by it and you're covered in two-pronged seeds. September gives you more mist flower, and black-eyed Susans are still going, which get a really diverse population of insects, both butterflies, moths, wasps, really great photo opportunities. The Spirea alba is still going, Helianthus, which is our native perennial sunflower family, the more mountain mint. Goldenrods there start in September and they can go all the way to November. There are some earlier blooming goldenrods that are in like July. Our native wood sorrel, little yellow flowers covering the ground. Pink turtlehead, which has a really neat flower that bumblebees are big enough to pry themselves into and get the nectar and pollen from. Late bone set, a really important late season nectar source, along with our asters and wood mint that's still producing. There's again coral honeysuckle still going. Swamp vervain is, I was really lucky to get this picture and have a native praying mantis looking right at me when I was looking at that plant. Snowberry is blooming and there's a cool wasp in that picture. Wild quinine still going. So that long bloom season, I'm talking months that some of these plants are putting on blooms. Monarda punctata is a bee balm that prefers drier soil. This is a white snake root, which is a native, again, never seen it available for purchase, but it volunteered here and I loved the prolific blooms it put on in the late season. In October, some garden phlox are still going. Spiderwort peeks its head up again. It kind of goes a little bit dormant in those real hot months of like August, September, but it picks up a little bit again here. Mountain mint, the short-toothed or broad-leaved mountain mint, the muticum, is still going into October, and honeybees are definitely frequenting it. Solidago is goldenrod and fleabane volunteers that I let go that just look lovely. And pokeweed again. Some of the late season asters, blue wood aster, white heath aster, turtlehead still going. The native hibiscus, which is a perennial, is blooming in late summer. This is in this picture, it's a very late bloom, but you can see there's some type of a bumblebee or a carpenter bee in there on that. Sunchokes are the perennial sunflower native to this area. The tubers are edible. Just be careful you don't eat too many at one time. They can cause a lot of indigestion. Some more of the plants that are still blooming in this late November season. And the picture on the right is actually serviceberry that was blooming again last year in November, put out a small bloom. So that was fascinating to see. White heath aster and aromatic aster is probably the showstopper for this late November season. This plant it's one plant and it's right at the end of our driveway. And it is just magnificent this time of year. I didn't have any goldenrods still blooming at my property in November, but this was at Mount Cuba Center in their trial garden. And you can actually, there's a little native bee flying up to it and it's covered in these other bees. It was very popular that time of year. And then this is the Hamamelis virginiana, which is the American witch hazel, which is native to this part of this ecoregion that actually blooms in November and December instead of the vernal witch hazel that blooms in like February, March, January, February, March. So you can get both of them and then you have a bloom from November to March when there aren't a lot of other things. And then I don't have anything blooming in December, but I wanted to tell you about this really cool orchid that is native. It develops this basal leaf in the fall when it's kind of doing the opposite thing that our ephemerals do. It's taking advantage of the leaf drop of the canopy overhead so it can photosynthesize, and then it keeps that basal leaf and photosynthesizes all winter until the leaf starts to wither away and the flower blooms. And I'm hoping that I will get some pictures of the flower blooms this spring to show you, because then it goes dormant again and it won't put out that leaf until the late fall, winter time. I think that that's all I have for you. Just try and pick the right plant for the right place and you will have a lot of success with native plants. I'm going to stop sharing. Chris, I see your hand up. Do you have a question? You are muted. I'm so sorry.
Do you ever grow black cohosh?
I haven't, but I have it on order to put in a couple of projects I'm doing this spring. I'm picking it up in a couple weeks. Why?
Oh, I don't know. I was interested in it for the medicinal qualities and I found out it's supposedly endangered. Is that true?
A lot of our native plants are, so I would not be surprised that it is, but I don't know that specifically.
Yeah. This was absolutely great. There were a number of comments in the chat about, oh, I can't write fast enough, too fast. So I guess we'll be putting the recording up. But I guess I wanted to ask you, do you know, do you ever go out and consult with people about what to plant, or do you know people who do, or how do you get advice on your site?
So I do that like kind of as a side gig that I can do consultations and kind of recommendations and things. Through Wild Ones, we have meetings and we teach people about all of these things. So that's another option if you're interested in learning about native plants and then kind of applying that to your own property.
I put the link in the chat to both the Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter and the national one.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
And I don't think I did a good job in explaining, but the majority of those pictures were from my property. So everybody can put these plants in and see them every day. Like you don't have to go to Bartram's. You can make your own Bartram's because Bartram's has a great selection of natives. They're after the Honey Fest, Justin and I walked around and just oohed and awed over the native plants that were there. But yeah, it's totally doable, and it's amazing what you plant it and they will come, and you get to see all these great insects.
Oh, one more question that I have is that Debbie was asking, where do you find golden ragwort and thimbleweed? And do you guys, can we post that? You had a directory of native plant nurseries.
Yeah, I'd love to share that with you.
Yeah, if you can send that, I can figure out where to post it on the website.
It's also on our website, so if you check out
Oh,
the websites, we have the lists up there. We also just added Penn State Extension just published the 2022 plant resource. I think it's called Plant Source. And the great thing about their list is that they confirm with all of the growers and the sellers that they're not providing plants that have any neonicotinoids in them. So they're not grown or treated with neonics. So if a nursery is on that list, you can be sure that you're getting safe plants for our insects.
okay. Is that on your resources page?
I believe it is.
Okay.
I know I can definitely email you, Chris, that list if you want to disperse it however you'd like.
Oh, that'd be great.
Jess,
Yeah.
can you bring up that native plant list just so it's in the video recording for just a couple seconds? People could pause on.
Yeah, I can. I think I have to figure out how to get out of this screen and into this one. Reshare. That was a good idea. I'm going to share my screen again just so you guys have this. Here's the nurseries, native plant nurseries in our area.
Oh, yeah.
And I just thought of another one. Good Host Plant is a Philly-based native plant nursery. So write that one down. You should be able to Google it, but Good Host is the name of it. And I'm not familiar enough with Philly to be able to tell you north, south, east, or west, but I know it's a Philly-based native plant nursery.
Let me see if I can-
Kirk has his hand raised. Kirk, can I help?
Yeah, so Jesse, you're among friends here, and I think we can have some back and forth conversation here. In a way, I kind of deliberately set you up with some comments that I made in my presentation about, at least here in the city, most of us can't really plant enough to feed our bees, and probably can't plant out our yard enough to really, I mean, obviously, it's an interesting discussion. We all want to plant in order to provide for native species in the area, insects and birds and so on. But we're limited in, I guess there's sort of two questions here. We're limited in the space that's available to us. And so we have to be strategic, I guess. And so I would just add in on this side of it, Doug Tallamy recently has been promoting an idea that we can build a sort of a national park system around the country by planting in our own yards. And that each yard is never going to make a difference, but in aggregate, those yards will provide that habitat that the native, birds and insects and so on need. So I recognize that. But so if you want to speak to that, you can. But the other thing I want you to talk about is, and it's not just you personally consulting, but the whole Wild Ones project is in fact reaching out into townships. And I forget, what is it called? Are they called homeowner associations, or what's the name of it? It's a 3-letter acronym.
HOA.
What is it?
HOA.
Yeah, homeowners associations. And you guys in the Wildlands Club were talking about HOAs, and it took me a while to figure out. So these are larger entities, townships, and the HOAs, for example, where they can be planting out a much larger area and be setting parameters for planting in a township or whatever in the common spaces and so on. So there's a lot of places where the same orientation that I suggested, you can't just plant for yourself. You need to get out there and do stuff in the wider community in order to make a difference. I don't know if you want to talk about how Wild Ones is doing that sort of thing or what you think about that.
Yeah, we are working with a couple of different townships who have approached us to say, hey, you know about native plants. We want to build native plants into our sustainability plan for the future. Can you give us some direction on that? We have some retirement communities that we're working with to help them plan out their common spaces and adding native plants and ecosystem function into what they just used to use as, eye candy, essentially, that was as good as plastic plants in the ground for as much benefit that they provided. So things are starting to shift, and people are seeing that each of us can make a difference, and then collectively we can make an even bigger difference. And those spaces that used to be useless turf grass essentially can be used for a bigger purpose, a better purpose. So we have an initiative that we're working on to help homeowners learn about decreasing their turf grass lawn. There are programs even in the state that you can work with to decrease your turf grass lawn. In the city, you may not have as much acreage as some of the suburban and exurban areas do, but even with whatever you have to work with, if you're mowing something once or twice a week and you're not using it actively, maybe think about planting it differently so that you don't have to mow it, because that's what makes our homegrown national park, when we all plant as much as we can in all of the spaces that we're not actively walking on or actively letting our kids run around on or actively, like walking the dog on. Just evaluate all those spaces and try and plant them with native plants as much as possible.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Kirk, in bee meetings in the past, I've challenged my fellow beekeepers in, less urban areas, but I challenge them. It's great to, plant all the native plants you can on your yard, to benefit as many pollinators as possible. Then the next step would be, talk to your friends and family and try to encourage them to do the same thing, your neighbors. But then there's even another level you can go to. You can get involved in your township. Like, we joined our township's EAC board, and I told them my nefarious plan for joining was to try to help convert open public spaces to more pollinator habitat, because we're not using it all. Why are we mowing it all? And they loved the idea, and we're making progress there. Our township, Jessie was involved in a project with 2 other people in the EAC. They changed an ordinance where if any development happens in the township now, the developer can only use plants from the updated list, and now they are all natives. All non-natives were removed, and only native options remain. Pennsylvania has what's the term? It's a preemptive state. So certain local laws can't supersede larger area laws. That's not the technical term for it, but it's hard for a township to say HOAs can't ban milkweed. But we're trying to look at other things we can do in our township that takes these housing developments with their HOA rules and guidelines and try to encourage more environmentally friendly practices and not so much, some, super strict planting regulations and ordinances that they have in their little HOA communities. And we're also revisiting our mowing ordinances. We have a 10-inch rule, but there's some other rules that don't make sense, and we're gonna work on changing that. It takes a year or two, but it's those little changes we can all be a part of. You know, a lot of people like, oh, I live in an HOA, I can't do this, can't do that. Join your HOA board, educate, share knowledge, get things changed. Like we all can do things like that. So I challenge my fellow beekeepers to try to do similar actions like that, and even bigger and beyond. I'm sure there's other great ideas out there as well.
Yeah.
Preaching to the choir, brother.
Well, I think it's true, but I think there's an interesting tension, and I think it's a good tension. You know, beekeepers and I don't want to get you started, Justin, about non-native, what is it, livestock, blah, blah. But the beekeepers, we do have a non-native species with bees. But the world and, you know, American public really has somehow latched onto this idea that the bees are in trouble. The bees need to be saved. And so we are in a position to sort of take that interest and turn it into an interest in the wider ecosystem. And also because we are closely involved in the lives of our bees, trying to keep them alive and so on. We're much more aware of what's happening out there. We see plants the way a lot of other people don't even see them. And so we're 10 steps ahead in a lot of ways. And as beekeepers, so we don't want to like put ourselves down and say, well, we shouldn't be keeping bees. And I think similar arguments could be made around native and non-native, because when people get involved with plants, they can be, you know, the weight can be pushing over toward the native side, but you don't want to, you know, to create, I think you don't want to have a, you know, a big fight about, you know, the non-native plants. So for example, street trees, you know, the golden rain tree, for example, is a good pollinator plant. There are a lot of pollinator species that use those flowers. It's not a native tree in this area, but it grows on the streets. All I'm saying is the interest in getting more trees planted allows for, you know, a space where you can push toward the native, but you can also acknowledge and accept, you know, some of the diversity that we actually have in our built environments.
Yeah, Kirk, that's a good point. I want to draw on a little bit there. I mean, because there's this really interesting debate happening within ecology about where the emphasis should be, right? I mean, everybody agrees, of course, that like native plants, the more native plants you have in an ecosystem, the better off that ecosystem is going to be, due to those, you know, long coevolutionary histories that Doug Tallamy, for instance, talks about. But you know, given the fact that humans, I mean, I forget what plant it was, Kirk, you mentioned that which Native American tribe was it that was like moving them around the continent?
Right, the Iroquois.
Right. And what was the plant?
The devil's walking stick, Aralia.
Okay, yeah, right. So I mean, as humans we've been altering our landscape and our ecosystems even well before colonialism, and so you know, there's one side in that ecological tension where some ecologists are saying, okay, well, like it is very important to be like a purist about it, about the native plant stuff, but then of course the other side is saying, well, we should take the gas off of that you know, like being really rigid about the native plants and focus more on ecosystem function and what that's going to mean with this like new mixture of plants, some of which might not necessarily be native. And I think like on a practical everyday level, that's not going to change anything with like, for instance, this information in this talk. Like it's just super important for us to, those of us who live in HOAs, to be pushing for native plants to be planted in the HOAs, and for us to all be educated about that and knowing about that. So in a certain sense, this debate is like on the more esoteric side that's happening just amongst ecologists. But maybe, I don't know, maybe it actually does, maybe that debate does matter on the ground in a practical way. I'm just not quite sure maybe how it would yet. It's something I think it's really important for us to be thinking about as a Beekeepers Guild. So yeah, these questions that Kirk brought up, I just want to emphasize, I think they're really important questions. And of course, this information, all of this information, for instance, that Jessie gave us is stuff that we all need to, I think, have as a baseline going forward with these questions.
No,
Now,
but
Kirk, I just want to clarify that I don't think people should not keep honeybees. The message I usually try to get out there is that we should not ignore some of the negative impacts high honeybee colonies can have on native pollinators. So, ultimately it's all about moderation, right? Balance. But it's the not talking about those studies that show, like, just for example, that one Guardian article over in England where honeybees are native, the whole, colony collapse and save the bees thing inspired so many beekeepers to keep honeybees, not necessarily plant plants and create habitat. And even over in England, they're admitting we have too many beekeepers to the detriment of other native bees here. So it's not, I think it gets confused a lot. I'm not saying beekeeping is bad. We just also need to acknowledge there can potentially be negative effects and to be mindful of that. And it comes back to moderation and maybe, lower colony densities.
I wonder if there are other people here. I'm sure actually some of the people who chose to join us already have some thoughts on these subjects.
Jessie, you one time mentioned something about that argument of the narrative where it's not just about native plants. What's the phrase? I mean, we always say with native plants, they have higher ecological functionality. But what's that other phrase that people apply to some non-native plants to give it more value? Ecological servicing, or what's the phrase, Jess?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're talking about people using non-native plants for a specific ecosystem function like soil stability or nectar or pollen or whatever, versus a native plant that would grow in the same place and provide multiple functions. Is that, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I just thought there was a phrase similar to ecological functionality, but it wasn't the same phrase. And it was like, it was a term being used to like justify using this non-native plant for this reason. Like, I don't want to use butterfly bush as an example, but butterfly bush, the non-native invasive plant, it provides nectar, but that's about it. So it only has one
Dustin,
benefit. Yeah.
Austin put it in the chat, I believe. Ecosystem services.
No, that's not it.
No.
Ecosystem services is actually an interesting concept, and I've read enough to make it sort of suspect in some ways. I mean, this is kind of a tangent from what Justin you were talking about, but ecosystem services is the argument that people benefit from ecosystems in their environment, and that we should be building up environmental, ecological settings and so on, because we will benefit from it. So it makes humans the sort of the central pivot around which everything needs to be done. It also kind of, it misses the point that these animals and these plants have been interacting on their own without us for millions of years. And that we need to appreciate that they have reasons for being that don't revolve around us being in their lives. Ecosystem services is kind of it's an interesting sort of pivot point for a lot of different kinds of issues. But I think, Justin, you were trying to get to a term or whatever that related to how plants can serve in a number of different functions because they've been integrated into the system as for, food, like the leaves. Caterpillars will eat the leaves and insects will collect the pollen, and they provide shelter for, the bees, the solitary pollinators that need a place to live in the stems and whatever. I mean, there's lots of different things that a plant can do, not just provide nectar and or pollen for honeybees.
Yeah, I just can't remember the phrase, but yeah, that's one of the key things about native plants are that a lot of them are host plants where only certain caterpillars can eat certain host plants. Most people, of course, the monarch caterpillar and milkweeds, but so many other plants serve specific functions like that, not just I don't know why I'm defaulting to butterfly bush providing some nectar. 'Cause that's
Right.
really the only thing it does, which isn't bad. It's better than grass, but you know, like a native plant in its place has higher ecological functionality. But the phrase is not, it's escaping me, sorry.
More thoughts from other people who haven't spoken yet? Anyone?
So I don't have much wisdom to offer to the group, but it has been a wonderful learning experience tonight and lots of food for thought. So thank you for being here and for sharing.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Oh, I am not, okay, I'm not muted. Thank you, Kirk and Jessie. This is great. I just get so excited about all the possibilities of planting these plants and people recognizing how interdependent all the systems are. Should be a key part of our educational mission. Anybody else?
If you're ever in northern Chester County, Jesse loves to give garden tours.
Wow, that would be fun.
Come over and check out all my fun bugs.
You get some great pictures.
It's because I'm out there all the time.
Wow.
Yeah, but I am very fortunate. I get a lot of visitors. I have yet, though, to get my favorite clear-wing hummingbird moth. I just cannot capture it on camera. I'm always amazed when I see a picture that somebody has it, because I see them, but there's just no catching those little buggers.
And what's some host plants for that?
The coral honeysuckle is a host plant for it. The coral berry and the snowberry are both native bushes that are host plants for them. So I give a different presentation that features my favorite caterpillar, which is the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. So if you've never seen that guy, Google him. They're the cutest caterpillars ever. But you need to have spice bush for them. So if you put a spice bush in your yard, you'll get the caterpillar. And that was one of the plants that started me on my infatuation with native plants, because when I realized I got to see all these cool bugs because of all these great plants, you won't get that other places. You have to plant them and then they come.
Yeah, I'll just put in a plug for the Wild Ones project. They have monthly meetings. You get on their email list. Jessie will send you the announcements. They get all kinds of very well-informed experts talking every month on different subjects. And they talk, as I said, about the homeowners associations and the township ordinances and all the rest of the nuts and bolts. And it, I mean, there are Wild One groups around in other parts of the country, but Jessie and Justin have been, and your daughter, right, is one of the officers too. So they really are pushing in a really important way. In Southeastern Pennsylvania, which includes Philadelphia, not too many people in the city of Philadelphia have been participating, and I know you'd like to be able to sort of expand in this direction.
Yeah, we have several members from Philly, but not they're not too active. But Chris came to us we were at the Philly Home and Garden Show in Oaks, and we had a great time talking to people, explaining, the differences between natives and non-natives, the importance in what we were doing, give them resources. We had DCNR pamphlets on invasive identification and eradication, and then some just a simple brochure that kind of gave you some easy to find native plants, in retail and local stores, so that you could start putting some of the easier natives in your properties.
I'm involved with a lot of the community gardens in Philadelphia. So there's 150 community gardens that would probably really love to connect with you.
Yeah, we want to expand and take over the world. Like we want to have our foot in every door. We just don't have enough time in the day or people that can really do that. But we are there to help when we can. We had the guild had us at the Honey Fest, so we had a table there, and we got to talk to lots of people in and around Philly, and spread some good information. So that was really a blessing to be able to, you know, just educate and tell people, because not everybody is going to be able to plant, and not everybody is going to be able to convert to 100% native. You saw my slideshow. I'm not 100% native, but I do what I can. And when you know better and you learn better, you can do better. So that's what we're there. We're there to plant the seeds. So maybe after they hear the message, you know, 19 or 20 times, they will get on board, and maybe they'll plant their first mountain mint and see all those insects and then be hooked, because, you know, it just doesn't get better than that.
Well, I guess if it's now 20 after 9, if nobody has any more questions, we should think about wrapping it up. I will be putting the recording in our mailings and on our website. I'll make a link for this, so people be able to access the information. But
Really glad I could make
Alvin.
it tonight. This is the kind of stuff I love to see. I think this is the kinds of conversations and responsibilities that Philadelphia Beekeepers Guild is uniquely suited for. And I love to see groups like Jessica's group, you know, teaming up. Really cool stuff.
Yeah, thanks for being here too, Austin. That was great to see you.
Yeah.
Anybody? Well, I'm gonna say thanks again and good night to everybody and close it down.
All right.
Chris, before
Thank
you stop
Thank
recording,
you,
I just
Chris.
wanted to say all the Wild One meetings are on YouTube. They've been recorded. They're free to watch. Wild Ones of Southeast PA. 2 meetings ago, there was a great presentation by Susan on how to deal with a myriad of invasive plants and what techniques work to battle them and which techniques don't. Last month's meeting talked about the Pennsylvania program that'll actually give you money to convert land to pollinator meadow. But Jessie told me they're out of funding for this coming year, but that's something that's ongoing. So check out all the meetings, free.
I'll put a link to that on too. Is that good?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's an excellent resource. I mean, they've been covering a lot of really important ground in a very good way for like 1.5 years or whatever it is. It's been every month.
Okay, good. Well, I
All
saved
right,
that. Well,
everybody.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
I'll see y'all
Bye-bye.
soon.